Good morning, everyone. It's great to see all the early risers. I am so excited that Bill Braniff is joining us. He is now the director of CP3, the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, but he is the longtime executive director of START at the University of Maryland. And every researcher on terrorism, every professor is so grateful to this man because he made data available to us that were never available to us before. Bill's going to tell us about a public health approach to counterterrorism, and I'm just thrilled to hear about this and your plans, Bill.
Thank you so much. Good morning. So my name is Bill Braniff. I'm the director of the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships at the Department of Homeland Security. And I'll have been there 6 months this week. So the new director, I would suggest. The first day I arrived at the department, the acting director, Jenny Presswala, handed me a draft strategy to adopt a public health informed approach to targeted violence and terrorism prevention. This might not be what you expect from the Department of Homeland Security, but it turns out that in 1983, the Centers for Disease Control started an office dedicated to violence prevention. And for 35 years, they've been collecting data, curating the evidence base, disseminating technical packages or capacity building materials out to behavioral health specialists, social workers, mental health specialists, to create a network of well-resourced and well-informed professionals who could do violence prevention about things like suicide, intimate partner violence, community-based violence. The Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships is adopting that model and now applying it to targeted violence and terrorism, a form of violence that the Centers for Disease Control has not yet tackled. If you think about targeted violence, it can come in many different forms, right? We're familiar with terrorism, and of course, 9/11 was the impetus behind the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. But we know that in recent years, there's been a massive spike in domestic terrorism, as well as bias-motivated hate crimes. We've also seen since 1999, the Columbine attack, a linear increase in the number of school shootings and other forms of targeted violence that are grievance-motivated, but not ideologically motivated necessarily. These three forms of targeted violence in which a perpetrator identifies a target ahead of time share similarities. And if you're upstream far enough, your prevention work can mitigate the likelihood of any of these negative outcomes. In a bad year of terrorism in the United States, there are between 80 and 90 terrorist attacks, most of which are over half of which are non-lethal. There are 9,000 hate crimes conservatively, and hundreds of school shootings. And so when we talk to American communities, they want us to address all these forms of targeted violence, not just the high-end terrorism that was the impetus for the creation of the department. Our response to mitigate the risk of these forms of violence include hardening targets, anti-terrorism, this is defensive, offensive counterterrorism disruptions to disrupt already mobilizing threat. But the third leg of the risk reduction stool is to prevent the number of individuals who ever mobilize to violence in the first place, right? And so our prevention work is that third leg of the stool, that upstream prevention, to complement other important forms of risk reduction, but none of which will actually reduce threat over time. Both anti-terrorism and counterterrorism work is a response to already mobilizing threat. And so it's not proactive, it's reactive. Prevention, on the other hand, is a strategy that allows us proactive tools or opportunities to decrease the likelihood of threat over time. A public health informed approach to violence prevention is based on the assumption that if we build the protective factors at the individual level, the family level, the peer level, the community level, and the societal level, we will decrease the number of individuals who ever see violence as an attractive option to solve their problems. They will have other forms of empowerment, right, that make the violence sold by extremists as a form of empowerment, it'll make that violent empowerment much less attractive. Think about diet and exercise. We know that diet and exercise do not decrease the risk of negative health outcomes to zero, but they sure as hell increase our likelihood of having a longer, healthier life. It's not predictive. This isn't a silver bullet, but we can decrease the likelihood of these negative outcomes over time if we invest in the diet and exercise at the societal, community, family, and individual levels. And so for 35 years, there's been research about what are those protective factors? What are those strengths that decrease the likelihood of violence? And alternatively, what are the risk factors that increase the likelihood that someone is going to turn to violence? Right? We have this data. Data at START, for example, has built off this public health modus operandi and applied it to targeted violence and terrorism. We've got a couple thousand individuals profiled in a data set called PIRUS and a complementary data set called BIAS, terrorist perpetrators and hate crime perpetrators. And we've looked at what the risk and protective factors are in those individuals' lives. So we have this information. The question is, how do we develop programming to address it? And that programming can be at the primordial level, right? That's investing in sort of civic institutions, a free press, right? These are the things, the healthy parts of a democracy that decrease the likelihood of violence. At the primary level, we're investing in communities, right? Think of a high school or a university. My organization funds students around the country at the high school and the university levels to invest in protective factors on their campus, right? So last year, we had a winning high school team that created a mentorship program to overcome social isolation for freshmen coming into high school, emerging from a few years of lockdown, right? So how do we create a culture at that high school in which mentorship is cool and including freshmen is cool, right? And helps you get that resume bullet for your college application so that bullying is less likely to happen, social isolation is less likely to happen, two risk factors for violence, right? Simple stuff. This is not rocket science. But how often does the government actually get to invest in building healthy communities? Right? We typically wait till the crisis is really bad and then we try to address it. This is a different approach. Right? Nobody's rappelling out of a Black Hawk here. We're building long-term cultures of nonviolence and then cultures of violence prevention. This is secondary prevention. Over 80% of school shooters leak their intention. 47% of mass casualty attackers leak their intention. 80+% of foreign fighters before they got on a plane to Iraq or Syria leaked their intention, right? Think about suicide for a second. When I was a kid, if someone ideated about suicide, the common wisdom was, well, don't say anything. You might push Bill over the edge. We know that's fundamentally wrong. Instead, you ask Bill a caring question. Bill, are you thinking about hurting yourself? What's really going on here? And then you try to work to get Bill into an environment where he can get support for whatever it is that's actually going on. Violence ideation occurs in the majority of instances of targeted violence in the United States. The question is, does a bystander take it seriously when they hear it? Do they know what to do with that information? Is there a non-criminal justice alternative? Because they're probably not going to call the cops. Right? Somebody blusters about starting a racial holy war. Dylan Roof told 2 different people he wanted to start a racial holy war. Is that bluster? Is that teenage bluster? Or a cry for help? People have to know what to do with that information. They have to have a non-criminal justice alternative to refer that person into some direct services. My organization now works with state and local governments, with law enforcement communities, with schools, and with direct service providers around the country. Through our grant program, we've started 35 behavioral threat assessment and management teams to date. They've opened up almost 600 individual cases now. Individuals have been referred into them, and that's 600 potential violent acts that we're now wrapping protective factors around, and we're decreasing risk factors, right? We're working to increase the number of direct service providers around the country who are willing to take referrals for targeted violence ideation, right? That's secondary prevention. It's at-risk individuals, wrapping direct services around them, often involving law enforcement, but not for the purposes of a law enforcement investigation, right? That's the nuance. And then tertiary prevention. When somebody has committed a crime, investing in rehabilitation and reintegration for that individual so that they're less likely to reoffend. Right? This is the most immature part of our apparatus in the United States. We don't invest much in tertiary prevention. My grant program does fund several NGOs who are doing this work, off-ramping individuals who want to get out of these movements or trying to rehabilitate, reintegrate them after incarceration. The single greatest risk factor for a violent outcome among an extremist is a criminal record. If you've got 10 extremists that you're managing, and one of them has a criminal record, that extremist is 2.2 times more likely to engage in an act of violence than the extremist sitting next to them. It's the single greatest risk factor. We know who the population is. We have control of that population while they're incarcerated. We know that that's the highest risk factor. We don't invest resources in de-risking that person. Right? You couldn't ask for a better opportunity to protect public safety and de-risk. We have to invest more in tertiary prevention. All right, why is this the right approach? How many elected leaders, general officers, senior law enforcement officials have you heard say, we can't kill or capture our way out of these issues? What do we spend our money on? Right? Killing and capturing our way out of these issues. But these are not law enforcement issues, essentially. These are about social, psychological, political challenges in our community. And so the solution can't just be a law enforcement or criminal justice solution. It has to be a multidisciplinary solution involving individual level psychology, social movements, social movement theory. This has to be addressed at the psychosocial, political sort of realm if we're really going to decrease risk over time. And this public health approach is inherently multidisciplinary, multifaceted. START data, one more time, again from the PIRUS data set. There is a structural gap for good reason, our Constitution. Our Constitution creates a structural gap in which if you are a domestic violent extremist and you want to kill or injure someone, and you plot to kill or injure someone, you are successful, according to our data, 60% of the time. 60% success rate for domestic violent extremist plots intending to kill or injure somebody. Because you can procure, train, fundraise, propagandize, recruit. It's all protected. So of course, if someone wants to go and engage in that behavior, they're going to be successful most of the time. There's no opportunity for criminal justice disruption absent some kind of other predicate crime. So it's at an assault, a firearms violation, a drug charge. That person goes to prison for 1 to 3 years. We haven't de-risked that person, we've delayed risk. All right? That structural gap, 60% of the time, is exacerbated by a volume problem. Since the early 1990s to the last 5 years, there has been a approximately 2,000% increase in the number of mass casualty plots. First 5 years of 1990s to the last 5 years for which we have data, a 1,900% increase in mass casualty plots. So the volume issue is exacerbating a structural gap issue. We have to plug that structural gap with something upstream, right, left of the criminal justice system. Violent extremists sell victimhood so they can sell empowerment. They have to sell victimhood because they have to sell you violent empowerment as a solution to that victimhood. Public health informed approaches are strengths-based. They build on the strengths of individuals, families, peers, communities. Right? And by building on those strengths, they avoid stigmatizing and stereotyping individuals. The same things that extremist narratives are trying to reinforce, right? Those stigmas, those stereotypes. And so it actually works against the siren song of violent extremism if you invest in these strengths-based public health approaches. From the global terrorism data database at START, we looked at the ideologies motivating violence in the United States in the first decade of the 2000s and the second. I'm not talking about the number of attacks, I'm talking about the number of different salient motivations inspiring violence. And from 2000 to 2009, compared to 2010 to 2019, the number of motivations doubles. There are new and different ideologies mobilizing individuals, emerging online. And so any fixed typology we have is going to be looking at last year's threat and likely missing emerging new ideological threats. And so any focus on ideology is inherently looking backwards. right? And you're going to miss what's happening in front of us. And so this is an ideologically agnostic framework. We're not looking at ideology. We're looking at behavioral indicators associated with violence, risk and protective factors for violence. It applies across the board. We don't have to single out communities. We don't have to focus on any one set of constitutionally held beliefs. We're looking at behaviors. Because this is overt, unlike clandestine, classified, counterterrorism, we can study this. We can apply program evaluation dollars to it, which means we can get better over time. We can invest more effectively. Right now, we're developing standards within our grant program to identify innovative practices, promising practice, and best practices. And the idea will be to invest our portfolio of resources every year to move capability through that pipeline so that we can best invest in our resources and decrease risk over the long game. The KKK was founded in 1867. We've destroyed hundreds of KKK claverns. It is still here. Al-Qaeda was founded in August of 1988. It has fought two superpowers head-on, the Soviet Union and the United States. It's still here. Columbine was 1999, and we have more and more school shootings every year. We have to invest in the long game. This is a long game investment. And one of the most important reasons, I think, for the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships to continue its work funding, building capacity of partners around the country to do this important work. We have a 5-point strategy. It's really modeled after the Centers for Disease Control. Curate an evidence base and get that content distilled into capacity building material, bring it out to the field. Use our field team to deliver sustainable evidence-based content and consultation. Invest in innovation through the grant program. Get the interagency on board and raise public awareness. Not rocket science, transformational if we can do this well. Thanks. I've got about 4 minutes for questions. Ma'am. Yes, thank you. It's a great question. The grant program is a $20 million per year budget for the last 3 years. The year prior to that, it was a $10 million budget. The Senate mark has us at $18.8 million this year, and the House mark has us at 0. There's controversy around these grant programs because people assume or people allege that we are doing things like censoring thought or singling out certain groups or individuals. We do none of that. Our civil rights, civil liberties team is embedded in every step of the process at the department. It is against the solicitation guidelines to do anything that will violate the privacy of civil rights or civil liberties of any American in the execution of this grant, and that is cause to end the grant were it to happen. It hasn't. But there's controversy about the work that we do, and it's largely a hangover from the years after 9/11, in which predecessor programs under the name CVE, Countering Violent Extremism, were accused of really stigmatizing, stereotyping the Muslim and Arab American communities. And that casts a very long shadow that we're still trying to come out from. This public health informed approach is, I think, a really strong way to show transparently what we're doing and why we're doing it. Thank you.
In terms of field staff, and kind of what competencies are you hiring to, and how are you thinking about them as public health approach professionals?
Great question. So we are not a public health entity. We're taking a public health informed approach, right? We're adopting principles that have been used effectively. But our team is a mix of former law enforcement officers, community outreach specialists, human services, so social workers, individuals with public health backgrounds from the state and local government levels. So it's really a pretty broad team, right? I imagine there's 3 legs to the ecosystem we have to build. We need communities to be engaged, so that means community stakeholders, affinity organizations, schools, coaches, right? Those are your bystanders who are going to see concerning behavior. We need the law enforcement community to be engaged. They need to trust these non-criminal justice referral mechanisms, and they need to be a public safety net if someone going through one of these case management plans is a risk to public safety. So we need law enforcement at the table. A lot of referrals are actually going to come to us from law enforcement, right? And then the third is the public health community. And so our field staff allows us to talk to those 3 important stakeholder types. Sir?
You mentioned 2 data sets.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, so those are not Department of Homeland Security data sets. That's from my former life as a researcher at the at the University of Maryland. Both of the data sets, or I mentioned three, I think. Pyrus and Bias, those are public available data sets. Michael Jensen is the researcher behind them. And the Global Terrorism Database, Aaron Miller is the researcher behind the Global Terrorism Database, also publicly available. Ma'am, last question, please.
So I come out of a journalism background, and in journalism there's been a lot of debate about whether to name perpetrators of violence, whether to use their photographs, and whether doing so might be feeding a question of fame. I'm wondering if anything in your research informs the right video approach.
Yes, I think the research would agree with those concerns that there are individuals who may be struggling with some sort of personal issue, and they might see this sort of infamy as a kind of empowerment, as a way to gain some sort of identity and perceived power. And the examples of perpetrators past become sort of inspiration for perpetrators future. Unfortunately, one of the behavioral indicators associated with violence is adoration of previous offenders. And so the more this information is available and we celebrate or make infamous perpetrators, the more we can feed that particular cycle. We have to balance that against the need for information in a free and open society, but not focusing on victims is often encouraged to highlight the human cost of this, and not just celebrate the perpetrator. Thank you. 1 second, sir. Howard, one more, or are we, sir? Thank you.
I just have a question. What are your thoughts about, for example, enabling students to do what's called guided student government?
Guided student government? I'm not sure I'm familiar with that term, but if it's self-explanatory.
No, what I mean is like, obviously, everything starts from schools,
Yeah.
I mean, that's where kids goes, right? And guided student government is a thing where, like a movement, I'm gonna say, which can be guided by professionals, by social workers, by office like yours. And this type of guided student governments will create what it's called a community of students who sort of like act as leaders. And kids themselves will be looking into joining this type of community, and sort of like it will be like a preventive mechanism. You know what I'm
Yes, yeah, I understand. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that is a different way to describe the exact program that we invest in. The program is called Invent to Prevent. And the Department of Homeland Security and other US government entities have been funding a version of it, both domestically and international, for a very long time now. Thousands of students have gone through it, and when they go through these semester-long experiences, the deliverable that they come out at the end of the semester, they create apps for phones, and they create public awareness campaigns, and they do all sorts of cool stuff. But they are the deliverable, right? The student is forever changed when they go through this experience, and they become the cultural ambassadors that sort of build these healthier communities. The mentorship program I mentioned, how simple is that? The student government adopted it and said, we're just going to keep doing this. Like, why would we ever stop doing this, right? This is great. The students get a little bit of scholarship money. If they, are mentors, they get resume bullets. These cultures, the only way we win is by moving cultural goalposts to a place where violence is not an acceptable solution. We have to understand that violent extremists are literally moving cultural goalposts in the other direction, trying to make violence acceptable. And so we have to win in that space. Thank you. Thank you.